Good morning, juniors. We are going to be walking through chapters 5 through 7 here of The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. These are the ones that do not have a reading response to go with them, so I thought that they'd be particularly good for just some lecture discussion questions here for the time being. And as you'll notice over the weekend, I graded 1 and 2. I don't remember if I graded 3 and 4 yet. Either way, I think we're off to a good start. Some of the basic things to remember just in general about these responses are that quotes are necessary. One quote is a minimum, 2 or more quotes are enough to allow you to get full points. Make sure you explain what the quotes mean or where they're coming from, include the author's name. The formatting of the titles I haven't been a stickler with, and the reason for that is that The Diamond as Big as the Ritz is classified as a novella, kind of halfway between a short story and a novel. So I'm open to you either quoting or italicizing it. I haven't dinged anybody for that, but just be aware that there's a bit of ambiguity over how that's formatted. You should be using Fitzgerald's last name whenever referring to him, except for the first time you use his name, in which case it should be the full name once. You should also be italicizing and writing out the full title of The Great Gatsby. The word the is important there, as a student several years ago reminded me by writing the word the on every paper copy of Great Gatsby responses that I passed out because I had neglected to write it. So just some gentle reminders for that. I'm sure you probably by now saw my note. Make sure that you're doing your own work, especially for these questions, which I'm adding to try and make you feel like you're still getting something out of the class that you couldn't just read on Spark Notes or something like that. Please make sure that you're doing this work. So we'll jump right into discussing these quotes here. These are from 5 through 7. Again, these are ones that do not have a reading response. The questions that I'll be putting up shortly over this lecture is going to be our points for these chapters. All right, here and there, clusters of elms made delicate groves of shade, contrasting strangely with the tough masses of pine forest that held the hills in a grip of dark blue-green. Even as John looked, he saw 3 fawns in single file patter out from one clump about a half-mile away and disappear with awkward gaiety into the black-ribbed half-light of another. John would not have been surprised to see a goat-foot piping his way among the trees or to catch a glimpse of pink nymph skin and flying yellow hair between the greenest of the green leaves. We have a situation here where we have, again, kind of a Garden of Eden allusion all the way up to the beginning. John thinks that this is the Garden of Eden, this is paradise on earth, and I think the description of kind of the foliage, just the beauty of it, the unimaginable perfection happening, clearly shows that. But then we have a change in the second sentence here. John would not have been surprised to see a goat foot piping his way among the trees. I think that this probably is an allusion to the Greek god Pan, traditionally shown as half goat, half man, playing a flute, and oftentimes seen as kind of an especially pagan, especially kind of indulgent god that was related to a lot of parties, a lot of kind of overdoing it with food and drink. So John, at the same time, is blending these two illusions. This illusion of Christianity, the Garden of Eden, but then instantly blending these kind of pagan or non-Christian illusions that are happening here. We also catch a glimpse of pink nymph skin and flying yellow hair, and I think we see that with Kismine in a minute when she shows up. But I think, again, Fitzgerald's purpose for writing this sort of paragraph is to play with that idea of the Washington family compound in Montana being heaven or being hell. And we'll see that especially in chapter 6 when we have the men at the bottom of that pit, which I think symbolizes hell, that Fitzgerald's playing with what is good and what is bad, what is desirable, what is undesirable, what is happiness, what is sadness, and the fact that John thinks it's Christian kind of paradise but then instantly compares it to kind of these pagan ideas shows John probably doesn't have a good idea of what this actually is. There are too many kind of signals for him to pick up to definitively say, yes, this is Christian, or yes, this is paradise, or yes, this is happiness, rather than anything else. Moving on to the next quote here, he was enjoying himself as much as he was able. It is youth's felicity means happiness, as well as its insufficiency, that it can never live in the present, but must always be measuring up the day against its own radiantly imagined future. Flowers and gold, girls and stars, they are only prefigurations and prophecies of that incomparable, unattainable young dream. Very, very much a quote that could appear in The Great Gatsby. We have John sitting, or rather walking, around the Washington family compound and realizing that if you're happy in a place, it's always happiness compared to what could be. It's always, well, I'm happy, but if tomorrow this were to happen, I would be happy in a brand new way. So I think we see that in The Great Gatsby with Gatsby obviously being in love with Daisy, constructing his whole life around getting to meet her, and then once he meets her, it's disappointment. I think, again, he thought, once I meet her, I'll go back to being 17. I'll go back to having this chance at love. I'll go back to being exactly the kind of person without any of the loneliness or failure I've ever had. And we see that it doesn't work out that way, that in fact life is kind of more miserable after he meets Daisy. But a very, very Great Gatsby-esque quote here with the idea that when you're young, you're constantly comparing what's happening now against what could be happening in the future, and it's only once you get into the future that you realize you kind of gave up being as happy as you could in those earlier moments. All right, next quote here. "You have made an enormous impression on me," said John's eyes, "and I'm not so slow myself." "How do you do?" said his voice. "I hope you're better this morning, you darling," added his eyes tremulously. I love that Fitzgerald plays with John's eyes speaking rather than just his voice here. And so the idea that we can say one thing but clearly be thinking another, and we can tell that about people, is an important idea. It took me a couple times, honestly, the first time I read this, to figure out what Fitzgerald was doing with the dashes, that's where his other body parts start talking there. But I think it's a really clever way of talking. And again, I think so much of the story has to do with John not necessarily saying what he's thinking. When he meets Percy's father, especially in chapter 6, he's going along with these stories where Percy's father's saying this horrible thing about the black men and women that he's enslaved, the people in the pit that he's planning to kill. And while John is a little shocked by that, he just kind of goes along with it. So I think John responds to Kismine by not revealing how much he loves her, in the same way he responds to Mr. Washington by not revealing how terrified or disgusted by him he is. John realizes you can say more with your eyes than your words, but eyes are harder to hear, to put it ironically. Anyways, let's move on. He was critical about women. A single defect, a thick ankle, a hoarse voice, a glass eye, was enough to make him utterly indifferent. And here, for the first time in his life, was beside a girl who seemed to him the incarnation of physical perfection. "Are you from the East?" asked Kismine with charming interest. So I think, again, we have the sense that perfection is afoot here. And that John has been seeking perfection. John is someone who, like Gatsby, was willing to instantly kind of write women off, maybe a bit of a misogynist. But Kismine represents perfection the same way that Daisy represented perfection to Gatsby. And Kismine asks him, "Are you from the East?" It seems as though if she has charming interest, she's wondering if he's the kind of boy or young man who could potentially be the kind of person her father sees her with. And I think that gets complicated in chapter 6 because we realize Kismine's never been allowed to talk to young boys, that her life probably would not at any point become normal, in the same way none of the Washington family has a normal life, even though a very rich life. So I think we see Kismine again associating the East with old money, wealth, status, success, but I think, this compound is so perverted that the ideas of those things anywhere else in the world are irrelevant. All right, next quote. Your father wants you to be proud. We are, she answered, her eyes shining with dignity. None of us has ever been punished. Father said we never should be. Once when my sister Jasmine was a little girl, she pushed him downstairs and he just got up and limped away. So this idea of pride also being associated with never being punished, again, shows how kind of upside down the morals are at this place. That one should always be above the rules because they're Washington, even if that means assaulting your own parents. The interesting thing here is that John also seems to be, in a way, kind of parroting his own father's words to him. John realized his father wanted him to be proud by always knowing that his family believed in him, always knowing where he belonged. John seems to kind of be trying to give that same advice to Kismin, but Kismin totally misinterprets it and says, yes, I can be proud because I've never had a rule that was applied to me. And I think we see that the Washington family in general believes they're entirely beyond rules. So I think it makes sense that Kismin would associate pride with never ever been punished. All right, next one here. I think that sophisticated young people are terribly common, don't you? I'm not at all, really. I'm very innocent and girlish. I never smoke or drink or read anything except poetry. I know scarcely any mathematics or chemistry. I dress very simply. In fact, I scarcely dress at all. I think sophisticated is the last thing, you can say about me. I believe that girls ought to enjoy their youth in a wholesome way. When I was reading this passage, and maybe for some of you it was the same way, it sounds so much like Daisy describing the birth of her daughter and how she just wanted her daughter to be a fool because that's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a pretty little fool. It seems as though Kismin thinks the same way a bit, that she never reads anything except poetry, that she's purely interested in art. She doesn't know any mathematics or chemistry because why would she ever need to? She's a young woman on the Washington compound. The idea of being concerned with how the world actually works or getting some sort of job related to these things is just beyond imagination. I think, again, we see her eagerly embracing the idea that she shouldn't make a life that's in any way examined. She shouldn't have to learn anything that's not going to make her just kind of have a good time. She shouldn't be interested in anything that's not just kind of pleasure without consequences. I think, again, she represents Daisy in the respect that she's willing to sign up to a large degree with some of the negative associations with femininity or womanhood here. All right, last quote from chapter 5. You haven't asked me to kiss you once. I thought boys always did that nowadays. John drew himself up proudly. Some of them do, he answered, but not me. Girls don't do that sort of thing in Hades. So we again have John having some pride about where he came from, that even if he stands out as odd because he didn't try to kiss Kismin, and Kismin wouldn't have disagreed with that. She would have kissed him back. John says, where I'm from, that's not how things are done. And again, he seems to be embracing, according to his father's advice, that idea that he's from Hades, that he'll continue to do things regardless of where he ends up in the world, to some degree, the way he was taught to do things in Hades. All right, moving on to chapter 6 here. I may skip some of these just because they're the same, and I want to make this reasonably short. The slaves' quarters are there. In my youth, I was distracted for a while from the business of life by a period of absurd idealism. During that time, they lived in luxury. For instance, I equipped every one of their rooms with a tile bath. They had orders to bathe every day, and they did. If they hadn't, I might have ordered a sulfuric acid shampoo. I discontinued the baths for quite another reason. Several of them got cold and died. Water is not good for certain races except as a beverage. Really shocking first salvo from Mr. Washington, and it's unbelievable the level of just, I think, ignorance and racism and discrimination that his father shows. Obviously, the idea that absurd idealism would cause somebody to treat other people as human, that seems very kind of extreme. The idea that several of them caught cold and died. Water is not good for certain races except as a beverage. Again, just the kind of arrogance and hate involved in that. It very much seems like he's almost a prototype for Tom Buchanan, that they're both obsessed with race. They're both obsessed with the superiority of the white race, or at least what they believe is the superiority of the white race, and willing to kind of openly advertise it. I think that they're very similar in that regard, and if there's any redeeming quality about Fitzgerald's discussions about race in here, it's that he puts his most overtly racist words in the mouths of the characters we see as most villainous, the ones that we're supposed to dislike the most. Whether or not that makes, the racism in this story forgivable, that's a different story. But I think it maybe makes a point on Fitzgerald's side that the most racist character is somebody like Mr. Washington, who is also the most evil character. All right, I'll skip the next one. That's just Percy's father, Braddock, revealing that the cage exists. The next part here is when they get to the cage. And again, it's this hole in the ground that men are suffering in. I don't think we can think of that as anything but hell. So I'll read this quote here. He broke off. They'd come to a large cavity in the earth about the circumference of a merry-go-round and covered by a strong iron grating. Braddock Washington beckoned to John and pointed his cane down through the grating. John stepped to the edge and gazed. Immediately his ears were assailed by a wild clamor from below. Come down to hell. Hello, kiddo. How's the air up there? So I think it's an image of hell, but it's also ironic. One, John is from Hades, which, like we said earlier, is another word for hell. So John came from hell, and John, in a way, gets to kind of ascend from hell into heaven to see what's going on. At the same time, it seems like Fitzgerald's totally put this world on its head. The people in hell are the people who are the most noble, the best, the most like us, the ones who actually have kind of a good sense of humanity and a good sense of themselves, and the people who are supposedly in heaven as gods or angels or just people who are righteous are the most evil here. If we think of this as, a metaphor for heaven and hell, it seems like hell, Fitzgerald makes, as the kind of place you'd actually want to be, that actually has the kind of people you'd respect in it. Whether or not that makes Fitzgerald a heretic, or whether or not he's just playing with the idea of what we've always seen heaven and hell to be, or in the 20th century what we've made heaven and hell to be, is another question. But I think it's a clear image of hell, this pit in the ground that men are suffering in. And also, it's ironic because we've just had Braddock Washington, Percy's father, come across as such an arrogant, angry, hateful, scary character that I think for many readers it would be hard, if not impossible, to take that seriously as kind of a stand-in or symbol for God, or the Christian God in that way. So, here's the part where John is picking up on who's in the pit. It was too dark to see clearly into the pit below, but John could tell from the coarse optimism and rugged vitality of the remarks that they proceeded from middle-class Americans of the more spirited type. So again, these are the people who I think continue today to be the kind of most noble in society, the middle-class Americans on their way up, who are optimistic, who have rugged vitality, the kind of self-sufficient American who is working hard. And the idea of them being in hell, again, should make us wonder how these images are actually working. I think Fitzgerald, especially in this quote, goes out of his way to call the men in hell the best kinds of Americans and the best kinds of people we can imagine. And then we have to ask, okay, so is that actually hell? If it's actually hell, does it line up with anything that we do know about hell? So, interesting questions to be asking. we'll move to this question here where the man is engaging with Braddock Washington. He's the captain of probably an Air Force plane or some other plane, and he's just speaking to him and trying to appeal to him to let the men out of the pit. You're not a humanitarian and you're not fair-minded, but you're human, at least you say you are, and you ought to be able to put yourself in our place for long enough to think how what, demands Washington coldly. How unnecessary. Not to me. Well, how cruel. We've covered that. Cruelty doesn't exist where self-preservation is involved. You've been soldiers, you know that. So again, appealing to the human side of Braddock Washington, this man is trying to do. And Braddock Washington essentially saying, I'm no longer human. And whether, again, that's because he's divine or that's because he's so greedy, and this is what kind of capitalism run amok does to somebody, turns them into not a human, but just kind of a heartless robot willing to kill, that's up to you. But I think we have to ask what this captain is trying to appeal to, which is his humanity, and why Braddock Washington throws that away so quickly. And the easy answer seems to be Braddock, kind of going back to the description of Kismine and Jasmine, doesn't believe any rules apply to him. That if it makes life easier to kill somebody, that's what you do, because he sees that as self-preservation. All right, last quote from 6 here. Nevertheless, cried Washington with a touch of anger, he tried to run away. Do you expect me to take chances with any of you after an experience like that? Again, a series of ejaculations went up. We see that disconnect. If Washington was failing to understand the captain's position because the captain was trying to appeal to his humanity, Washington doesn't understand that the men have hope, and that to him is completely incomprehensible because Washington doesn't have any need for hope, or at least at this moment doesn't feel he has any need for hope because he has everything. I think it's another point where we again might admire the men in the pit, that hope is something that I think we just admire in humanity in general, but especially the hope that things can get better if you work hard enough, in the kind of story of America and the American dream. All right, just a few brief quotes from 7 here. July, under the lee of the Diamond Mountain, was a month of blanket nights and of warmth, glowing days. John and Kismine were in love. He did not know that the little gold football, inscribed with the legend Pro Deo et Patria et Saint Maida, which he had given her, rested on a platinum chain next to her bosom, but it did, and she for her part was not aware that a large sapphire which had dropped one day from her simple coiffure, not quite sure how to say that, was stowed away tenderly in John's jewel box. So we have this young love happening, and these items which are both obviously very valuable in terms of literal value, but also very sentimental going on here. I think it shows that John and Kismine are about halfway between worshiping wealth the way Percy and Braddock Washington do, but also like the quote-unquote average American that we'll hear a lot more of by the end of the story, that these items don't necessarily just mean, oh, they could be converted into a lot of cash or they could show status. They're things that remind each other of each other, and that makes them ultimately valuable. All right, and then very last quote. Neither of them had ever kissed before, but in the course of an hour it seemed to make little difference. The afternoon drifted away that night. When a last breath of music drifted down from the highest tower, they each lay awake, happily dreaming over the separate minutes of the day. They had decided to be married as soon as possible. I think in a way that this is, like in The Great Gatsby, right before we go into New York and have the party, the moment where the world seems like anything is possible, the world seems like happiness is just within grasp, and then of course it goes away because of the men in the pit rioting and the planes bombing, things like this. Even Kismine revealing to John that he's probably going to have to die to stay with her. But I think it's the kind of coda or ending to the opening that we had that was so much a Garden of Eden metaphor, that night they're deciding to be married, but they've also kind of eaten of the tree of knowledge. John understands what is truly happening here, or will by chapter 8, and then kind of paradise falls apart. So I'll stop there. I hope this helped make more sense of the book. I'll be putting up questions very shortly over this lecture. Those will be due by the end of the day tomorrow, and then I'm confident that by the end of the week, if not earlier, we will wrap up with this story. I hope you are all having as reasonably good and social a time as you can be in quarantine, and I will talk to you soon.